Welcome back, everyone. It seems like you all have been sending in some sources about how to deal with people who just talk and talk and talk and don't stop talking.
Yeah, and it's a pretty amazing mix we have. You sent in stuff from practical guides on escaping those conversations to like introverts just venting online and even a look at things from the overtalker's point of view.
Definitely diverse. And that just goes to show how universal this experience is, right? Like, I'm sure almost every single one of our listeners has been stuck in that conversation that feels like it's going absolutely nowhere, wishing you had an eject button.
Oh yeah, totally. We've all been there. So let's jump right into these sources and see what we can find to help you handle those chatty situations. We've got a WikiHow guide that's like, I don't know, almost a secret agent's handbook for breaking free. There's a Psychology Today article that takes a more, let's say, compassionate approach, and even a Reddit thread where introverts are just letting loose with their woes and tips and all.
It's amazing what people will share online, right? That Reddit thread is just, oh, gold. It's pretty funny how a shared experience dealing with a chatterbox can create such a sense of, like, online camaraderie.
Oh, absolutely. Misery loves company, right? But before we get sidetracked by the humor of it all, why don't we start with that WikiHow article, 12 Ways to Get Someone Annoying to Stop Talking. It's actually full of pretty clever tips that are surprisingly practical.
Okay, so let's say you're trapped. You're in that conversation that's spiraling out of control. What's the first thing you should do, according to WikiHow?
Well, polite interruptions are key, obviously, but the way they describe it is brilliant, really. It's like, you've got to act before the conversation turns into a tidal wave, right? Start subtly, like making eye contact, opening your mouth like you're about to speak. If that doesn't work, maybe a raised finger, or even, the classic hand raised in the air like you're back in school move.
Oh, I love those visual cues. It's like sending up a flare, right? Like, Mayday, Mayday, I need to escape this conversation.
Exactly. But what if the person you're talking to, like, completely misses those signals? What if they're oblivious?
Well, in that case, you might have to resort to a verbal interruption.
Yeah, and then WikiHow stresses that it's got to be polite. So instead of just blurting out, hey, be quiet, you try something like, mind if I jump in for a second? Or sorry to cut you off, but I really wanted to say something about that. It acknowledges the other person, but it also asserts your right to actually participate in the conversation.
It's such a delicate balance, isn't it? Being assertive, but also respectful. It's a skill, for sure. But interrupting is only half the battle. What do you do once you've actually managed to, grab the reins of the conversation?
Redirection, that's the key. And WikiHow suggests something that, honestly, I'm a little iffy about. You use flattery to take control. So, for example, you might say, that's an amazing story about your dog. It reminds me of when I used to work as a dog walker. Let me tell you about...
I see what you mean about being hesitant. It feels a little manipulative, don't you think?
Right, like you're just using their story as a launch pad to talk about your own thing.
Exactly. So what's a better way to redirect without resorting to, insincere flattery?
Well, I think honesty, even if it's a little awkward, is always the best policy. But the core idea of redirection is still good. So you can gently steer the conversation towards a topic you're both actually interested in, or just acknowledge their point and then smoothly transition to something else.
Oh, okay. So instead of the flattery tactic, you could say something like, that's interesting about dog training. Speaking of training, I've been trying to teach my cat to. You acknowledge what they said, but shift the focus.
Exactly. Much more genuine. But what if, even with all that polite interruptions, redirection, you're dealing with someone who just doesn't get the hint?
Oh yeah, those folks, the ones who just steamroll over every attempt you make to set a boundary. Exhausting.
Right. So in those situations, WikiHow actually encourages you to be honest but polite about needing to end the conversation. Like, instead of agonizing over how to escape, just be clear. Something like, I hate to cut you off, but I need to get back to whatever you were doing. Thanks for understanding.
So basically, rip off the conversational Band-Aid. Just be direct.
Exactly. And it sets a firm boundary without being aggressive. It's like saying, hey, I value our conversation, but I have other stuff to do. And speaking of stuff to do, WikiHow also suggests setting a time limit up front, which I think is brilliant.
Oh yeah, like right at the beginning.
Right, from the get-go. So you might say, I've only got a few minutes to chat before I have to get back to work, or I'm about to head out so we can only talk for a minute or two. It lets the other person know the clock is ticking.
It takes away that awkwardness of trying to escape, right? Like, how do I gracefully exit this conversation that seems to have no end in sight?
Exactly. But let's be real. Sometimes even the most polite, most direct approaches just don't work. There are those people who are just relentless talkers.
The conversational steamrollers, they just keep on going no matter what.
Yeah, so for those super extreme cases, WikiHow suggests you come up with a realistic excuse, a little white lie, to preserve everyone's sanity. Now, I'm not saying I love this approach, but I can see how it might be necessary sometimes.
Absolutely. Desperate times call for desperate measures, right? What kind of excuses do they recommend?
Nothing too crazy, just simple, believable stuff like, oh, I need to make a quick phone call before they close, or I promised my mom I'd swing by, or even the classic, I need to use the restroom.
Those are all great. I mean, who's going to argue with a bathroom break? But what I find really interesting is that WikiHow actually has advice for dealing with a known chatterbox before they even start talking. They call it the friend rescue maneuver.
Oh, yes. It's like having your own personal extraction team for chatty situations. So you and your friend agree on a signal beforehand, like a cough or a certain phrase, anything subtle. And when one of you gets trapped by the talker, the other one sweeps in and politely rescues you.
Brilliant, like something out of a spy movie. The eagle has landed, I repeat, the eagle has landed. Commence rescue operation. But it also just shows you how common this problem is, right? Like, we're so desperate for solutions that we're inventing secret signals and rescue missions.
Absolutely. But beyond those practical tips, those escape tactics, you send in an article from Psychology Today that goes a little deeper into the reasons people might talk too much. 6 ways to deal with people who talk too much.
Oh, so it's not just about escaping, it's about understanding.
Right. And this one approaches the whole issue with a lot more empathy. Like, it suggests that excessive talking could be coming from loneliness, anxiety, or even just, poor communication skills. So maybe the person isn't trying to be annoying. Maybe they're just struggling.
That's such a good reminder. Like, it's so easy to just write someone off as annoying without considering what might be going on beneath the surface.
Totally. It's like that saying, be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. We never really know what someone else is going through.
Exactly. And the Psychology Today article really emphasizes responding with compassion instead of just getting annoyed. Like, they even recommend using humor and empathy when you interrupt someone, to make sure they don't feel like they're being put down or something.
Yeah, it's about acknowledging their need to be heard, but also gently steering the conversation in a more manageable direction. And you know what I found interesting? The article also talks about doctors dealing with chatty patients, which is such a unique perspective.
Oh, yeah, that is interesting. Why is that so significant?
Well, imagine you're a doctor trying to diagnose someone who just will not stop talking. It's a high-stakes situation. You need to figure out what's wrong, but the patient's excessive talking could lead to, like, a misdiagnosis or the wrong treatment.
Wow, that's a great example of how this isn't just about social etiquette. Dealing with talkative people can have real-world consequences. But of course, not everyone takes such a, let's say, nuanced approach, right? You also shared this absolutely hilarious Reddit thread where introverts are just venting their frustrations and sharing all their coping mechanisms, polite and not so polite.
Oh yeah, that thread is pure gold. Like, one user described talkative people as goldfish people, just swimming in circles, never really getting to the point. And another one just said, straight up, my energy is drained, which is like the perfect summary of how it feels to deal with a chatterbox, right?
Totally. It's like that introvert hangover. You need a full day of solitude to recover from one conversation. But beyond the humor and the shared misery, that Reddit thread also shows how draining excessive talking can be, especially for introverts.
For sure. And it's not about being, annoyed or whatever. It's about recognizing and respecting your own energy limits. You are not obligated to listen to endless monologues, even if the person means well.
You have the right to remain silent. Speaking of respecting your energy, you also sent in the Introvert's Guide to Handling Chatty People, which had some awesome advice on setting boundaries, both at work and just, in life generally.
Oh, yeah, that one was great. And it really emphasizes being honest about your needs, which can be tough for some people. It's okay to say, hey, I need some alone time, or I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed right now.
It's like giving yourself permission to recharge. And it had some good advice for navigating chatty workplaces too, right? Like strategic lunch breaks to escape the office gossip, mastering the do not disturb signal on your computer, even just advocating for a bit more privacy in your workspace.
Right. It's all about creating those little pockets of peace and quiet, carve out a little sanctuary for yourself in the midst of all the chaos.
And one tip that really resonated with me was using visual cues to deter those unwanted conversations.
Oh, yeah. Like putting on your headphones, even if you're not actually listening to anything, or strategically placing a book on your desk as a do not disturb sign.
It's like sending out a nonverbal stay away signal. But let's be honest, sometimes even visual cues aren't enough, especially if you've got that coworker who just doesn't pick up on subtle hints.
In those situations, being direct is key. And you actually shared another source called Introvert's Boundaries with Chatty Coworkers. It had some good scripts for doing just that. So instead of beating around the bush, you can just say, hey, I really need to focus on this project right now. Can we chat later? Or I'm on a tight deadline, so I can't talk right now.
It's about being assertive, but not aggressive, right? Just setting a clear boundary. And one thing that both of those introvert guides emphasized was that it's okay to prioritize your own needs. You don't have to sacrifice your well-being just to be polite.
Absolutely. And sometimes taking care of yourself means setting those boundaries, even if it feels a little awkward at first. But before we move on to some of the other sources you sent in, I want to pause for a second and hear from you, the listeners.
Yes. Have you ever felt trapped by a talker? Like you just can't escape the torrent of words? What are your go-to strategies for those situations? Do any of these tips we've talked about resonate with you?
Leave a comment and let us know. This deep dive is all about sharing and learning from each other's experiences.
Okay, so we've covered the practical stuff, the introvert perspective, but you also sent in this piece by Emma Lord, The Overtalker's Handbook, Struggles of the Chatty, which gives us a totally different viewpoint.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. It's funny, relatable, and surprisingly insightful. She talks about all those classic overtalker struggles, constantly losing her voice, hating awkward silences, accidentally oversharing.
Like she's reading my mind. Okay, maybe not all of it, but definitely some relatable moments there. What I found really interesting about her article is that it humanizes the overtalker. Like they're not just these oblivious chatterboxes, they actually have feelings and insecurities too.
For sure. They might feel pressure to fill every silence, or worry about losing their train of thought, or just have trouble controlling their impulses. It's not always about being inconsiderate sometimes. It's about their own internal struggles.
It makes you realize that everyone has their own quirks and their own reasons for behaving the way they do. And that maybe, just maybe, we could all benefit from a little more understanding and a little less judgment.
Right. Like, it makes you wonder, could we be the annoying talker sometimes? Maybe not to the same extent, but I bet we've all had those moments where we've dominated a conversation or rambled on a bit too long.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure I've been guilty of that myself. It's all about self-awareness, right? Being mindful of how our words affect others and being willing to adjust our approach if we need to.
Exactly. And sometimes that means taking a step back and asking ourselves, am I really listening to the other person, or am I just waiting for my turn to talk?
So before we jump into that Healthline article about excessive talking as a potential mental health symptom, which is a whole other layer of complexity, let's take a moment to reflect. What if the key to dealing with talkative people isn't just about learning to escape or set boundaries, but also about developing a deeper understanding of communication itself?
That's a great point. It's about recognizing that everyone has their own unique way of expressing themselves, and that what might seem annoying to us might actually be someone else's way of connecting or coping or just making sense of the world.
It's about approaching conversations with curiosity instead of judgment and seeking to understand rather than just control. But now let's dive into that Healthline article and explore the more serious side of excessive talking, because sometimes it could be a sign of something deeper going on.
Right. It mentions that excessive talking can be a symptom of a lot of different conditions. We're talking ADHD, anxiety, even bipolar disorder.
And it also describes something called pressured speech, which is basically when someone talks so fast, it feels like they're barely taking a breath. Have you ever noticed that? It's like a constant stream of words with no pauses.
Oh, yeah, it's almost like they're being driven by some internal force they can't control. And it's definitely different from someone who's just, enthusiastic or high energy.
Right. And then there's something called disorganized speech, which can be a symptom of schizophrenia and other disorders of psychosis.
Right, and that type of speech can be pretty hard to follow because the thoughts might be jumbled or illogical. And it's important to note here that we're not saying that everyone who talks a lot has a mental health condition.
Definitely not. But if you're concerned about your own talking habits, or if you know someone who's struggling with excessive talking that's causing problems in their life, it's always a good idea to talk to a professional.
Exactly. There's no shame in seeking help, and it can make a world of difference. But now let's shift gears for a minute and look at things from the listener's perspective. You shared an article called Why You're Annoyed When Someone Talks Too Much, and it really breaks down why we find excessive talking so irritating.
I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Well, it's all about perceived value. If we're not getting anything out of the interaction, if we're not learning anything new, if we're not feeling heard or understood, then we tend to get annoyed.
Makes sense. It's like if someone's droning on and on about something I couldn't care less about, my mind is going to wander. And then the annoyance sets in.
Exactly. And the article points out that people who talk a lot often dominate the conversation, which leaves very little space for the other person to actually contribute. So you end up feeling ignored, unimportant, or even invalidated.
It's like they're not even acknowledging that you're a person with your own thoughts and feelings.
Right. And it's especially frustrating when they ask what the article calls fake questions. These are questions that are really just a way for them to launch into a monologue about
Oh,
themselves.
I know exactly what you mean. It's like they'll ask, "How was your weekend?" And then before you can even answer, they're often running with a detailed account of their own weekend adventures.
It's the ultimate conversational bait and switch. But sometimes it's not even intentional. Some people are just so wrapped up in their own world that they don't even realize they're monopolizing the conversation.
It's like they're living in a conversational echo chamber. But the article also mentions those people who just only talk about themselves, which can be super draining to listen to.
Oh, yeah, those folks. It often comes from a place of insecurity or a need to feel important. And sometimes it involves a lot of bragging or name dropping, which can be incredibly grating.
It's all about the performance, not the connection. But you know what the article suggested as another reason for annoyance? Jealousy.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's like if you're someone who crave attention, you might be more irritated by people who talk a lot because they're essentially stealing the spotlight.
That's interesting. It's like our own insecurities can influence how we react to other people's behavior. Sometimes what annoys us about someone else is actually reflecting something we wish we had ourselves.
It's deep, man. But beyond all those psychological dynamics, the article also talked about sensory overload as a factor in annoyance.
Oh, yeah, sensory overload. That makes sense, especially for introverts and highly sensitive people. Too much stimulation, including verbal input, can just be overwhelming.
It's like their nervous system is on high alert, and every word feels like an assault. But even people who aren't super sensitive to noise can experience sensory overload sometimes. Like if you've had a long day, you're mentally drained, and then someone starts talking your ear off about something you couldn't care less about.
It's like your brain has reached its limit and it just can't process any more information.
It's not that you don't care about the person. It's just that your nervous system is tapped out. And in those moments, it's totally okay to honor your need for quiet and space. But let's talk about another type of annoying talker. Those who are just uneconomical with words, as the article puts it.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. It's those people who use way more words than necessary to get their point across. They go off on tangents, they repeat themselves, and they just generally pad their speech with unnecessary details.
It's like they're writing a novel when a simple text message would do. And it can be so exhausting to listen to because you're just waiting for them to get to the point.
And it's especially annoying when they repeat the same thing over and over again. Like, didn't I just hear you say that? Do you think I wasn't paying attention?
Exactly. You can feel a little disrespectful. Like they don't trust that you're capable of understanding what they're saying the first time around. But, sometimes repetition can stem from insecurity or anxiety.
That's a good point. It's like they might be seeking validation or reassurance or maybe struggling to articulate their thoughts clearly.
It's a good reminder to have a little compassion, even though we're feeling annoyed. But let's be real. Sometimes people are just plain inconsiderate. They talk over others, they interrupt constantly, and they just seem completely oblivious to the impact they're having on everyone around them.
And in those situations, it's important to set boundaries and protect your own energy. You don't have to be a doormat for someone else's conversational dominance. But before we dive into more tips for handling those situations, let's hear from you, the listener. What are your experiences with talkative people?
What are your pet peeves, your biggest frustrations? What strategies have you found helpful?
Share your stories and insights with us. This deep dive is all about creating a space for shared learning and exploration. It's amazing, right? We started with this simple idea of people who talk too much, and now we're diving into all these layers of psychology and communication styles and even like sensory overload. It's wild.
I know. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, except instead of tears, we're getting insights. But speaking of layers, I think it's important to remember that the whole idea of talking too much is pretty subjective, right? What one person finds annoying, another person might find totally engaging.
Absolutely. It really depends on the context, the relationship, the topic of conversation. So many factors. And, sometimes people might accuse you of talking too much just because they disagree with what you're saying.
Ooh, good point. It's not always about the quantity of words. It can also be about the content. But if it's not about content, how do you know if you're genuinely a chatterbox or if it's just a matter of perspective?
Well, that Healthline article we talked about had some good tips for self-assessment, like Start paying attention to how people react when you're talking. Do they interrupt you a lot? Do they seem distracted or try to change the subject? Those could be signs that you might be dominating the conversation.
It's like those subtle cues that tell you maybe you need to dial it back a notch. And the article also mentioned reflecting on whether you often say more than you intended, or if you have a habit of oversharing.
Oh, yeah, the overshare. It's like word vomit. It just comes spewing out before you can stop it. But I guess that also ties into being more mindful of those conversational boundaries we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. It's about being aware of the impacts your words are having on other people and respecting their time and energy. And let's be honest, if you find yourself struggling to stop talking, even when you know you should, or if people have actually told you to your face that you talk too much, well, that's a pretty clear sign that you might need to adjust your approach.
Yeah, no one wants to be that person, the one everyone avoids because they know they're in for an earful. But even if we're not full-blown chatterboxes, I think we can all benefit from being a bit more mindful in our communication.
For sure. Like, what were those practical tips from the Healthline article about how to become a more mindful communicator?
Well, one of the key things was just to pay more attention to how other people are responding to your words. Notice their body language, their facial expressions, whether they seem engaged or totally checked out. It's like becoming a conversational detective.
Ooh, I like that. Putting on your Sherlock Holmes hat and observing the subtle cues. And it also emphasized active listening, which we talked about earlier, but it's worth repeating because it's so important.
It's not just about waiting for your turn to speak. It's about really tuning in to what the other person is saying and trying to understand their perspective. It's about being present in the conversation, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally.
And the article actually suggested that mindfulness exercises can be helpful for developing those active listening skills. Sounds a little woo-woo, I know, but it makes sense. Those practices that help you become more present in the moment and aware of your thoughts and feelings, they can definitely spill over into your conversations.
Exactly. So instead of being stuck in your head, rehearsing what you're going to say next or thinking about your grocery list, you're actually engaged in the moment, truly listening to the other person. But you know what? Let's shift gears for a second. We've talked a lot about being the mindful communicator, but what about when you're on the receiving end of a conversational avalanche? We've already discussed escape tactics and setting boundaries, but are there other ways to cope with those relentless talkers?
Because sometimes, let's face it, those escape routes are blocked, and you're just stuck there, drowning in words.
Well, remember that hilarious Reddit thread we talked about? It was full of creative coping mechanisms. One user said they just zone out and let their mind wander when someone is talking incessantly.
Oh yeah, I do that sometimes. It's like mentally checking out while maintaining a facade of attentiveness. But I always feel a little bad about it. It's like, isn't that disrespectful to the person who's talking?
It's a tough one for sure. Maybe instead of completely zoning out, you could try focusing on just one aspect of the conversation that you do find interesting, even if it's just observing the person's mannerisms or their choice of words.
That's a good idea. Like find a little nugget of entertainment within the word blizzard. And the Reddit thread also suggested just giving one-word answers as a way to discourage the talker from going off on tangents.
Like a gentle conversational roadblock. But, these strategies are more about survival than engagement. Sometimes you just have to do what you got to do to protect your sanity, but sometimes even our best efforts to escape, redirect, or zone out just don't work. What do you do when you're truly trapped?
It's like being stuck in conversational quicksand. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink.
Exactly. And in those moments, I think it's crucial to remember that you always have the right to set boundaries and protect your own energy. You don't have to listen to someone talk endlessly just because they feel the need to.
And you don't have to feel bad about it. Like it's not selfish to prioritize your own well-being.
Right. And those introvert guides we talked about had some really good advice for setting those boundaries, whether you're at work or just out in the world.
And the key takeaway was,
it's okay to be honest about your needs. If you're feeling overwhelmed or drained, don't be afraid to say so. You can say something like, I need a break from socializing right now, or I'm going to go recharge with some alone time.
give yourself permission to step away. But sometimes, even when you're clear about your boundaries, you encounter those people who just don't get it. They push your limits, they interrupt constantly, and they seem totally oblivious to how their behavior is affecting you.
It's like they're wearing conversational blinders. They just can't see anything beyond their own need to talk. So what do you do when you encounter those folks who just won't take no for an answer?
That's when you got to bring out the big guns, right? The assertiveness techniques.
Exactly. It's about standing your ground and communicating your needs clearly and firmly, even if it feels uncomfortable. Sometimes you have to be direct. You can say something like, I've asked you to please let me finish my thought, and I'm feeling disrespected when you keep interrupting me.
It's about advocating for yourself and letting the other person know that their behavior is not okay. And sometimes that means just walking away from the conversation entirely.
You're not obligated to subject yourself to verbal abuse or disrespect. It's totally fine to excuse yourself and remove yourself from the situation. But as we've been talking about, these social dynamics can be tricky, and sometimes the best approach is a combination of strategies, maybe a little bit of escape, a little bit of boundary setting, and a dash of compassionate understanding.
It's like mixing up your own conversational cocktail, tailored to the specific situation and the specific person you're dealing with. But before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to hear from you, the listener. What are your experiences with talkative people?
What are your biggest pet peeves? What strategies have you found helpful? Have you ever had to set boundaries with someone who just wouldn't stop talking? Or maybe you're the one who sometimes struggles to rein it in.
Share your stories and insights with us. We're all in this together, navigating the wild and wonderful world of human communication. Welcome back, everyone. It's amazing how much we've uncovered about this seemingly simple topic of talkative people. We've gone from those escape strategies to psychology and even touched on mental health.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. But, as we wrap up this deep dive, something keeps coming back to me from all these sources. We've focused so much on handling those who talk a lot. But what about the other side of the coin? The folks who, well, don't talk as much.
That's such a good point. I think sometimes we forget how much those quieter folks bring to the table. Like, it's so easy to get caught up in the whirlwind of words that we miss the value of quiet observation and careful listening.
Absolutely. Those who are more reserved, they might not be the ones grabbing the spotlight, but they're often the ones soaking everything in. Processing information deeply, considering different angles, and noticing those subtle details that a chatterbox might completely miss.
It's like they're the silent powerhouses of communication. And when they do speak up, their words carry so much weight because they've been carefully considered and crafted.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the most powerful messages are delivered through a well-timed question, a thoughtful observation, or even just a knowing glance. It's not always about filling the air with words.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the key takeaway isn't just about learning to escape from those chatty Cathys or set those boundaries. It's also about appreciating the power of quiet observation and thoughtful listening. It's about finding that balance, right?
Exactly. Communication is a two-way street. It's about finding that rhythm with the other person, that flow where everyone feels heard and respected. So yeah, go out there armed with those tips for handling the overtalkers, but don't forget the power of silence and the importance of choosing your words carefully.
And maybe, just maybe, the next time you find yourself face-to-face with a chatterbox, you'll approach the situation with a little less frustration and a little more curiosity. You never know what gems of wisdom might be hidden beneath those layers of words.
It's been quite the journey, hasn't it? We've explored so many different angles, from practical advice to psychological insights, and hopefully we've given you some tools to navigate those talkative encounters with a bit more confidence and maybe even a touch of humor.
Because let's face it, sometimes you just have to laugh at the absurdity of it all. So until next time, happy deep diving, everyone. Remember to listen with intention, speak with purpose, and embrace the beautiful complexity of human communication.